السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم انشر علينا رحمتك وأنزل علينا حكمتك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام. I hope everyone is doing well. Alhamdulillah, we remembered to come today after a week off. That always throws things out of whack when you have a little bit of a holiday and you come back. And Salat al-Fajr is getting earlier and earlier. But there's more barakah. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, the barakah of my ummah is in the early morning. So this is actually when you have the most productive time in the morning, especially the recitation of the Qur'an. So this is something very special that we're doing, especially because we're able to pray Salat al-Fajr in Jama'ah, and then we're also able to pray Salat al-Duha. So it's a great reward. It's a reward of Hajj and Umrah, tam, if we were able to complete the prayers in the masjid, the congregation. So today is going to be something a little bit interesting, a little bit different, because we completed discussion of Adam, Habil, Qabil. So today we're going to talk about two of the lesser known prophets, Sheeth and Idris. So there's very little in the Quran about Idris. There's nothing about Sheeth, but there's a lot in the Bible about Sheeth, right? And from pre-Islamic texts. So we'll talk a little bit about both, and then we'll be in a good position, inshallah, to talk about Nuh alayhi salam from next week, inshallah. And there's so much in the Quran about Nuh. There's so many lessons. So we can't possibly complete that in 1 week. So we're gonna spend a lot of time with Nuh alayhi salam, because there was a reason that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used the story of Nuh on multiple occasions to illustrate very important points. Plus, we have a tendency of thinking that it was Adam and then there was Noah. It's like we skip, that's like the next day. But actually, there's a great deal of time. I'm going to argue that it's over 1,000 years, maybe 2,000 years that passed between Adam and Nuh. And this is something, according to the most authentic sources, this is roughly the amount of time that's between them. It seems like a lot of time, but it's not, because we also believe that the lifetimes were much longer than they are today, and they spend in the hundreds of years. So this is part of the reason. And then there's a lot of overlap between generations as a result. So Sheeth is one of the sons of Adam alayhi salam. And Sheeth, it means gift from Allah. And the reason that he was named gift from Allah is because Allah gifted him to Adam after the death of his son Habil. Because we know what happened between Habil and Qabil. So after the passing away of Habil, who was very close to Adam alayhi salam, who was a very righteous son, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as it's mentioned in Surah Al-Kahf, فَأَرَدْنَا أَن يُبْدِلَهُمَا رَبُّهُمَا خَيْرًا مِّنْهُ زَكَاةً وَأَقْرَبَ رَحْمَةً. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when even in his deprivation there's giving. So Allah subhanahu رُبَّمَا مَنَعَكَ فَأَعْطَاكَ. So sometimes Allah, he deprives you of something, but in that he's actually giving you. So in this case, Allah took away one of his righteous servants that was very beloved to Adam and then replaced it with Sheeth, which also indicates that all of this is from the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All of that has already been decided. And he replaced him. Habil was not, according to what we know, was not a prophet and a messenger, but Sheeth was a prophet and also a messenger. He was a Nabi and he was also a Rasul. He was also a messenger, a gift from Allah, very close to his father. He learned a lot from his father. And it seems kind of strange that why is there a prophet overlapping with Adam? So now you have two prophets at the same time. And you're like, okay, well, who is he going to preach to? Because because it's not mentioned in the Quran, right? So now we are going into, so if you, the sources that we're using today, the main source is as At-Tabari, right? So Tariq At-Tabari is the main source for our discussion. Also, you'll find it in Ibn Kathir, but the reality is they're getting it from pre-Islamic texts, right? Seth. And it's mentioned, Seth, right? It's mentioned, directly in the Bible. So there's obviously reference. Idris is mentioned in Surah Safat in the Quran. So with Idris, and also we have authentic, and we have all different types of hadith about Idris. But for Seth, we don't have those resources. So we're going pre-Islamic, but it's bridging the gap. So we mention what is consistent. And this has been reported by the Islamic scholars from the very early generations. So they drew on these sources of information, and some of it is not really religious in nature. These are the accounts that have been passed along from generation to generation. This is the way it was, an oral tradition of history. So for some reason, we think that if something is recorded in a book, that's more authentic. But in reality, somebody might write a book, but they could write whatever they wanted, right? The oral tradition is actually more authentic because people will not accept the oral tradition unless if they believe it to be true, right? So we call it tawatur, right? In a hadith with the exact wording. So this is not tawatur in the wording, but there's an aspect of tawatur in the ma'na, in the meaning, right? Because if somebody starts adding to the story, embellishing the story, what do the rest of the people in society do? They say, hey, you got it wrong. That's not how it happened. I heard it differently. So this is how oral traditions, have been passed around, and oral histories have been passed around from generation to generation. So he's a gift from Allah. He's very close to his father. Who's he preaching to? This is a very interesting part of the story. He is preaching to his nephews and nieces. Because Adam alayhi salam, he has many children, and then his children have dozens of children, right? Over hundreds of years. So now you have hundreds, maybe thousands of, probably hundreds, of nieces and nephews in the very beginning. And those are all the people that are on the earth. They all live together close by. But shaitan promises are intact. Shaitan is on task, okay? Now at the time, is there anyone that disbelieves in Allah? No one. There is no concept of disbelief in Allah. There's no concept of kufr. Is there anyone that is committing shirk, associating partners with Allah? No one has any concept of that. Even most of the crimes that we know of have not been committed. But we know about the one major crime that was committed, that was the crime of murder. That was, as the Prophet ﷺ said in the authentic hadith, that the very first crime that was committed was the murder of Habil by Qabil. And because he was the first one to do so, he has the sin of his own murder, and all of the people that do that and follow that tradition until Yawm al-Qiyamah. This is, in parenting, we call this modeling, right? So you have to be aware of the fact that your behavior is being watched. So you have to model, because others, whether you knowingly or unknowingly, imitated. So you should be aware of that. And if you have a sunnah, if you have a sunnah that is ugly and evil, then you'll be responsible for those that follow you. So at this time, Adam is ruling his children with justice based on Allah's law. Everyone is united together, but Shaitan has his plots. This is the talbis of Iblis. So he cannot go directly and tell you to disbelieve, right? He's going to go in steps. وَلَا تَتَّبِعُوا خُطُوَاتِ الشَّيْطَانِ. This is a very important ayah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he talks about shaitan, he says, do not follow his footsteps. Because shaitan is not going to pull you all the way to the end. He's going to go step by step by step. He is a strategic thinker. And, I spend a lot of time in Muslim majority countries. And we are, what I like to say, emotionally driven. I don't want to say emotional, that sounds very bad. Emotionally driven decision makers, right? Somebody gets mad and they make a decision because they're mad. Shaitan loves that. He doesn't want us to think strategically, or to have a vision or a goal in mind. He wants us to be reactive based on the situation, based on how we're feeling. in the moment, because he is the one that is very good in tadbir. But who is even better in tadbir? Allah subhanahu wa makaru wa makar Allah. So they plot, Allah plots. Wallahu khairul makirin. Right? So Allah is the best of all of those, and it sounds like something negative because makar, it sounds like a plot and it sounds like something which is sinister. But actually, a makr is something that is complex. It doesn't have to be something which is negative or something which is sinister. It shows that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not overwhelmed by complexity and subtlety because Allah is al-latif. Allah is, so lutf has two meanings, right? Allah, lutf means kindness, latif also means the subtle. Allahu latifun one of my favorite verses. Allah is latifun bi'ibadihi, right? Because not only is he kind, but he is so subtly aware. And the fact that it's in the same word, it means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is aware of the most seemingly insignificant need of his abd, of his servant. So if you join the two meanings together, then you result in that. So Shaitan is doing his plots. Then what Qabil decides to do is he leaves and he wants to live far away. So this is what they always do. They turn 18, they want to move out. So Qabil, he wants to do his own thing. So the first thing he does, he wants to move out. So he decides to live far away. And Adam and his children are in the mountainous regions. And Qabil, he ends up in the valleys, in the level regions of the earth. And Imam al-Tabari, he mentions how um, the prophet Sheeth was responsible for the burial of Adam. And there's a rumor, nobody knows, but that there are secret texts that are located within the grave of Adam alayhi salam. This has been mentioned by Imam al-Tabari. Nobody really knows where the grave is. Many people have said that it's in the valley of Abu Qubais, located in Mecca. So there's a lot of, but these are rumors. This has been reported before even the prophethood of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that Adam is buried in Arabia. Others said according to the Christian text, I believe the accounts are that he is buried in Jerusalem. So this is also another very common report, and others say lots of other places. So needless to say, he goes to these flatlands further away, and Shaykh, he's telling everyone not to mix with the people of Qabil who went to the dark side, right? Because now they have moved out, they've gone to the other side. And don't hate me for saying this, I'm just repeating what I read. Don't be mad. This is literally what is reported in the text. They said that the men from the Qabil's family were not good looking, but the women were very good looking. And the people who were following Shaykh, the men were very good looking and the women were not very good looking. Right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Qur'an that He makes some people fitnatan, ba'duhum li ba'd. So some people are made as a trial or a tribulation for other people. That's why we make dua, لا تجعلنا فتنة للذين كفروا. We don't want to be a test for a tribulation, even for the disbelievers. We don't want to get in the path, right? So then Iblis comes in the form of young men that are seeking, or a young man who wants to be an apprentice and to learn how to be a blacksmith. And so he's working with the blacksmith, and he takes the metal and he fashions it and designs a flute. And he introduces everyone, because there's no concept of, like, like a nai, like a basic metal flute, and he introduces it to everyone, and they love it. They're like, this is amazing. Then Shaitan doesn't stop at that. Then he introduces a drum, and he started to play the drum, and when people heard the sound, they were really attracted to it. And they came up with the conclusion, they said, wow, the civilization of Qabil, it's way ahead of Shaykh and his followers. And they ended up forgetting the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because Shaykh, he's such a Debbie Downer. Everybody's having fun, And Shaykh is telling all the people to remember the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, saying what's right and what's wrong. It's a very familiar story, right? From like nowadays, right? And Shaitan is teaching everybody that this life is about enjoyment and about having a good time. And once you have music playing, what's the next thing? The next thing is then they start to dance. And according to this, these are, as I mentioned, these are pre-Islamic texts. When I say pre-Islamic, I mean before the Risala. So what's reported is that Shaitan started to have influence over them. He started to have control over them. This is very important because Shaitan has not told them to do anything bad yet. This is very important because the footsteps of Shaitan is that he wants to have influence before he wields that power. First he wants to have influence over you. So he was having them do music and to dance and to have parties, and he was very concerned with having them dedicate a time. And this is when the concept of the weekend began. So Shaitan encouraged everyone. Take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt, right? Because we don't know how authentic it is. Just go with it, right? So the reports are that he designated the day of Saturday evening would be the day in the end of the week when everyone would gather and they would party. And so this is according to the reports, it goes all the way back to the time of the children of Adam, the concept of having a weekend and having that as a time of rest. So then some of the youth, they were visited by Shaitan, and he started to make them question the laws that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had imposed over them. That why can't we mix with our family members? Why can't we mix with our relatives? What is so bad about them? Because the people in the mountains, they're the followers of Adam and Shaith, and they say, well, they look really nice. They're having a great time. We're missing out. Uh, what do people say nowadays? They say, but they're not hurting anyone, right? This is a classic argument that, oh, but it's a victimless crime. What's so bad about them? And so the people of the mountain, they began to hear the flute, they liked it, they saw the women. Remember, we said the women, they were very attractive, so they got kind of pulled into that and more attracted to that. And then, according to the reports, the ladies from the people of Qabil, they saw the men from the people of Shaith. And according to the reports, the men from the followers of Adam and Shaith, they were very attractive. So according to the report, this is when tabarruj happened. Because then the ladies, they started to dress up in a way to attract, to get male attention in order to attract more attention of others. And this is when there was mingling taking place with the purpose of attracting the opposite gender without boundaries. So it's said that this is the first time when zina took place. That prior to this, until this phase. I'm talking about a lot of time has passed, by the way. In our last discussion, few hundred years have passed, right? Between the time of Adam and the time that we're talking about. Maybe 1,000 years have passed. And now the concept of zina is very familiar to people, right? Because before they had no concept of that. It's like, okay, you get married and that's what you do. Now they have, oh, there's another way of doing this, right? So people are starting to consider that and think about that. Now, the problem with this is that the people of Shaykh, they came back and they said, guys, you can't believe what I'm seeing. Like, you are missing out. Like, they are having a great time. And what ends up happening is the group of Qabil becomes bigger and bigger. And keep in mind, we're making Qabil out to be like the biggest, the worst person, but that's not the reality, right? The the people in this time, they don't know how to sin, right? Because we believe that we are people of fitrah. So who is planting all these ideas? And who is the one that is literally hand holding them in order to get them to that point? That is shaitan. Shaitan had to teach us, right, what to do and how to do it. The only thing that kind of came naturally was that original sin. When I say original sin, I mean the first sin. The first sin being the murder of Habil, and that was because of jealousy. So jealousy is something that is a natural human emotion which you have to really be cautious about and be careful about. Now Shaitan, he's taken them all these, all these steps, but his real goal is shirk. And he has not been able to achieve that. And Shait, he continues to live for a few more decades, advising his people. And actually, most of the prophets after him, they come from his children. Not all of them, but most of the prophets in the following generation, they're among his own children. It's said that he had, like, I don't know, 30 something children. I don't know, it seems like a lot, but that's what they said. Right? I didn't ask if it's all from the same mother. Um, I think so, but no, no, no. They're married. No, they're married. Adam is married. His children are married. Shaith is married. It's only the people, some people from the followers, and not all people, but some people from the followers of of Qabil that start to adopt a different lifestyle. Now, this is important. We're actually in the month of June, and June is also Pride Month, right? So this a big discussion within this society, right? I'll probably talk about that this Friday, inshallah. Not about pride, not about LGBTQ issues specifically, but about the idea of mujahara. That we live in an age in which people are proud of their misdeeds. And the person who is everybody has their imperfections, everybody has their flaws, everybody has their mistakes, right? But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is as-sattar. He is the one that has covered people in their imperfections and their sins. And so uh, the person veils themselves and erects a barrier between themselves and Allah's forgiveness when they start to boast and to have pride over being in a state of disobedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? This is one concept of mujahara, kind of showing off about that. And so this is the issue with adopting a specific lifestyle. And this goes back all the way to the time of Sheath. Not the idea of gay relationships, but the idea of relationships happening outside of marriage and people being boastful about that or proud of that or normalizing that, right? And that's one of the beautiful things about the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Believe me, from the time of Sahaba, zina was a reality. It happened even in that time, right? We don't like to talk about it, but all of these things have existed. But this ummah until today, it has never been the norm. This ummah doesn't accept it. Even if the rest of the world is doing it, we say no. Our ideal, our standard is above that, is higher than that. And this is very important. Even if we fall short, we still have our goals are still aspirational, that we should be living up to that ideal. Okay, so then Sheath, he's now in his deathbed and he entrusts this amana, like this trust of guiding people and leading them to his most noble son. And so his noble son, out of all of his other sons, is Enos. And he is the one who continues that legacy. Then after him, he has other children, and his most famous children is Canaan, right? And this is the descendants, they're considered from Canaan, right? Which is also a biblical Canaanites, right? It's mentioned. Um, um, the people of Palestine are considered to be the descendants of Canaan. So it goes all the way back to the grandchildren of Adam, great grandchildren of Adam alayhi salam. And then there is Muhallalal, who is mentioned in the biblical sources. But what's interesting is he is also mentioned in the Zoroastrian sources. So he's also mentioned the Persians, they claim that he is Hoshang, I think. Hoshang is the Persian name for Muhallalal, who is the king of 7 regions. And according to the Persian sources in the Zoroastrian texts, they say that he's the first to cut trees, the first to build cities, make castles, civilization, build. He's the one that builds the city of Babylon. Right? This is the first major city in the world in Iraq. This is between the Tigris and the Euphrates. This is the cradle of civilization. This is the father city of Sus, located in Iran today. Close to Iraq, defeated Iblis and his army. So this is also reported that Iblis gathered an army in order to fight them directly, and he was unsuccessful. Shaitan lost in that battle, and then and then as a result of that battle, then the army was scattered into the mountains and the valleys, and then it said that there was also a battle with the jinn. So Shaitan and the jinn, they tried to battle him directly, but wasn't able to do so. Okay. Then the grandson is Enoch, right? And this is who we're going to talk about. This Enoch is the biblical name for Idris. So now we're meshing into what we find in the Islamic text, in the Quran and the Sunnah. Now, this is very interesting because I mentioned I find it very fascinating that when we talk about these early prophets, that what you find in Judaism, in Christianity, in Islam, in Zoroastrian texts, in all of these different texts, they all seem to be very consistent. You don't see a lot of contradictions in the different texts. So I find this very interesting because, for example, when you start talking about Jesus, you get all kinds of stuff, right? Just the question of who's the father of Jesus, right? You know, the Jews, they have one story, Christians have another story, Christians, they have 4 different stories. Islam, of course, we know that he is born without any father. That's evident in the Quran. So you have lots of different stories. But when you go to the early prophets, Nuh, for example, you find what's in the Quran is almost identical, except for a couple of minor points. It's almost identical to what is mentioned in the biblical story. So why is that? I think it's because the 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 concepts are very simple. It's follow shaitan or follow Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Later, when you get into, you know, what is the position of Jesus, so people start manipulating. Later, when it goes into the question of following the laws of the Torah, then people have an agenda, they have a reason to change things. But here there's no agenda, everybody's on the same page. And so I think this is why things are very similar. And so from that descendant, he's the grandfather of Enoch, and then in between you have the son Jared, right? So this is what's mentioned in the Bible. This is as a Jarod, I think, Jarrod, but in America people they say Jared. And this is what's also mentioned in the Quran. إِنَّ هَذَا لَفِي الصُّحُفِ الْأُولَى صُحُفِ إِبْرَاهِيمَ وَمُوسَى. So according to many of the Mufassirin, what's mentioned في الصُّحُفِ الْأُولَى from the early scriptures, many of the scholars, they said these suhuf, they go back even to Adam, right? And that's where Imam al-Tabari mentions that these suhuf, the suhuf that were, and these are not a book, but these are some scrolls, some scriptures that they were buried with Adam alayhi salam, and his children and grandchildren, they also received certain scriptures, certain revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is important because we believe that they are the anbiya, they are the prophets, and then you have the rusul, you have the messengers. So the messengers, they have received the wahi, they have received this revelation. So it's not only the 4 books that we know about, there are more scriptures that were received than that. Okay, then the Quran mentions Idris as the next son. Now there is a common a rumor, by the way, that he is buried in the pyramids of Giza. I don't know if anyone has heard about this, right? Inshallah, we haven't broken the news yet, but our Umrah trip this year will include a trip to Egypt. So we'll visit the pyramids, inshallah. So we'll talk about all the rumors about what's going on in the, there are three pyramids, right, in Giza. So one of this goes back kind of thousands of years, that it's said that Sheath is Idris Enoch is buried in the pyramids of Giza, and it's also said that the Greek god Hermes, any shoppers here, right? Everybody knows Hermes, right? So I'm not talking about Birkin bags, right? We're talking about the store. Hermes is named after the Greek god Hermes, who was worshipped by the Sabians, the Sabi'in, because they believed that Idris was there. So it's very interesting. All the religions, they kind of, even the ones that are not based on Tawheed, right? They all kind of collapse into the same focal points as you go back and you go back to the earliest texts. So this is also connected with Greek gods, right? So they used to worship the pyramids because they thought that Idris is buried there. So they are also talking about Enoch, but not as a prophet, but as a type of a god, right? Because this is the way that they understood prophethood at the time. And this is, you've heard Dr. Tariq and others mention how if you go back to a lot of the early texts, even the Dharmic religions, Hinduism, if you go, Buddhism for sure, there's a lot that seems to indicate that perhaps these originally could have been monotheistic religions. Some people, they go as far to say that, oh, could they have been prophets? Yeah, they could have been prophets, but we don't know one way or the other, right? But could they be prophets? Why not? And then people manipulated and changed it later on. So this seems to support that idea. Now, the graves of Habil and Sheath are both located in the valley of Lebanon. This is what the historical reports say. Now, there's an exact location. If you go into Lebanon today, they say this is where, Idris and Sheath are buried. That exact location is probably made up. Most of the same. If you go to Jordan, for example, every other corner they say, oh, here's Shu'aib, here's Ayub, here's Musa, here's Wadi Musa. Anybody been to Jordan? Yeah, no. But if you go to Jordan, every corner they have a prophet, and surprisingly, a lot of the general information in terms of that prophet being buried in that town or that area is actually accurate. But that exact location is totally made up, right? In most of these, 99% of the cases, when people are like, oh, this is the grave of like Adam, it's usually made up, right? Nobody really knows. Somebody decided to make a grave and people started coming. So, you know. But most likely it is in Lebanon. So let's talk a little bit about Idris, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions Idris. So Idris was a prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The strongest opinion is that he is the third prophet. But personally, I don't know why we say that he's the third prophet. It's just the third prophet that we know about. I mean, I think that it could have been that there were a lot of other children that were prophets as well. So I'm a little bit skeptical about that claim. He is known as the first person to write with the pen. الرحمن علم القرآن خلق الإنسان علمه البيان اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم الذي علم بالقلم. He taught man by the pen. So the first person to actually utilize the pen is Idris. So the different languages, various languages existed, but the written word did not exist until Idris. Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma, he relates that he was a very tall man, that he was very good looking, he was very calm, very collected, he had a full grown beard. In the past, people also associated a beard with nobility and masculinity, like in muru'a, right? He spoke very clearly. He lowered his gaze when he spoke and was very dignified. What's also reported is that he was a very quiet person and a very reflective person. So he would only speak if there was a need to say something. And his main task at the time was to stop people from acts of corruption, right? Because the main crisis of the time is not shirk. The main thing is the issues related to lifestyle. People are going away from following the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Idris is the first one to take up arms against another army, fight against injustice. And all of this is happening because the population in the world is increasing rapidly. Because before it's basically one family, right? And lots of grandchildren, and then it spreads from there. And then he declares a war against the people of Qabil. He gathers an army of horsemen, and he is granted victory over them. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals, as a result of his hard work, his sacrifices, he said, I will give you the reward of all of the good deeds of all of mankind each and every single day. Right? And he says, O Idris, from those that follow you, I will have all of the good deeds doubled for yourself. Now, this is an amazing status. We don't know whether Allah has done this for anyone else. That out of all of mankind, I'm going to double the good deeds that you do, and the good deeds that everybody else does as well. And so Idris is thrilled. He's very happy. And now Idris is thinking, like, every moment, my account of good deeds is going up and up and up and up. So he's like, I've got a good trajectory. Let me stay with this. So he started to think, well, death might be approaching. So I have my friend who's an angel. And Allah has promised me this amazing reward. Let me cash in. I need to get this reward that Allah has promised me. So he talks to his angel friend and he says, can you hook me up? You know, he's got like wasta, right, with the angel. He's like, can you talk to angel? You're buddies with the angel of death, right? He seems like a nice guy. Talk to the angel of death. So the angel, his friend from the angels, he arranges for him to speak with Malakul Maut, with the angel of death. Because what does he want to request from the angel of death? What's he looking for? I mean, he's gonna die. Everybody's gonna die. Kullu nafsin dha'iqatul maut. But at least, what is he trying to accomplish? He wants to delay his death, not because he's running away from death, not because he doesn't want to die, because Allah made him an offer that every day he's gonna get the reward for his good deeds and the rewards of everybody else. So he's like, I need to maximize my benefit. I need to get as much good deeds as I can. So he says, all right, let me talk to angels of death. The angel carries him on his wings. We should all be friends with angels. You know, this has a lot of good perks, right? The angel was like, oh, just hop on. So he hops onto the wings, and this is in the hadith, by the way. A lot of what we said earlier, it's all made up. This is from the hadith. So he goes on the wings of the angel and he gets carried up into the heaven, and then he goes to the fourth level of paradise, the fourth level of heaven, and he meets the angel of death in the fourth level of heaven, and he speaks to him. Now, by the way, the angel is the one speaking to him, and then the angel says, okay, but I have a question. Where's Idris? And the angel, he says, oh, Idris, he's right on my back. He's right here. And the angel of death, he says, wow, ajaban. Astonishing. Amazing. I just received my orders that I need to take the soul of Idris, and I should take the soul of Idris where? In the fourth level of paradise. And I thought to myself, the Malakul Maut is like, how will I get Idris to come? How am I going to drag him to the fourth level of heaven? He lives on earth, and I've given this impossible task that I need to take his soul in the fourth level of heaven. And I'm like, how am I going to do that? He lives on the earth. I said, Alhamdulillah. So Malakul Maut is like, now it all makes sense. Idris came to me so I can take his soul. So Malakul Maut, he has his marching orders from above, right? So he takes the command and he takes away the soul of Idris alayhi salam when he is on the fourth level of heaven. And then also in Sahih al-Bukhari, it's mentioned that he went up when the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam went in the journey of Mi'raj. Where did he meet Idris? Also in the fourth heaven. So this is an indirect confirmation of the other hadith with the whole story that we mentioned. Some of the mufassirin in Surah As-Safat, anybody remember the ayah about Idris? Oh, mashallah, وَرَفَعْنَاهُ مَكَانًا عَلِيًّا. Allah says, وَرَفَعْنَاهُ مَكَانًا عَلِيًّا, that we raised him to a very high level. So subhanallah, وَرَفَعْنَاهُ مَكَانًا عَلِيًّا, when you first hear it, you think it must be the meaning. It should be, is it going to be literal? No. Normally you think that, my name, by the way, Refai, so it means elevated. It's metaphoric. It's not literal. Like, it's not like, oh, I'm taller than other people, right? رَفَعْنَاهُ مَكَانًا عَلِيًّا, that means that Allah raised him. So the meaning, you would expect it's majaz, it's metaphoric. But some of the mufassirin, they said, no. وَرَفَعْنَاهُ مَكَانًا عَلِيًّا mean that we literally raised him to the heaven, and we only took his soul when he was in that high and lofty status, when he was in the high level of paradise. So some people, some of the mufassirin, they said they took it literally. That's what it means. So Idris, he dies, time passes, and after the death of Idris, corruption spreads at a much greater magnitude. Because Idris is the one that consolidates the message. He is the one that reestablishes the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's victorious against shaitan. He's victorious against the army of Qabil and his descendants. He kind of establishes that peace on the earth. But then at least 1,000 years pass. So now we're over 2,000 years by my math, right? Which is a bit fudgy, but we're going to roll with it, inshallah. And then finally, Iblis has a great breakthrough. What's the great breakthrough that he's been working on from the very beginning? He finally convinced some people to commit shirk. So only after hundreds of years, over 1,000 years, over 2,000 years, finally he got some people not to believe in Allah. Now, why am I personally emphasizing this? I emphasize this because believing in Allah is part of our fitrah. It is something which is completely natural. It is very hard for people to be atheistic. Like, to be an atheist, you have to be very committed to that, okay? Because it goes against all logic that we just showed up out of nowhere. Like, you have to be very, very committed to that theory in order to explain it and to like wake up in the morning and be like, I'm just here by accident, right? There is a hub fitri, there is a natural inclination and love that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has instilled in every human being to love his Rabb, his creator. And the great indicator of this fitrah is the fact that shaitan had to toil, he had to work hard and struggle for such a long period just in order to get shirk. So if shaitan is working that hard, sisters and brothers, so we need to work at least a little bit as hard as shaitan, right? We should do a little bit, right? Because our sa'yukum sa'yan mashkura. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He notices our exertion, right? And our success is not really based on the outcome or based on the results. Our success is based on the effort that is displayed. Inshallah, next Sunday, we're going to talk about Nuh alayhi salam. We won't have time to talk about the flood. We're going to be talking about the ship. And everybody, every time they saw him, sakhiru min. Every time they saw this, what is this old guy? What's he doing building a ship in the middle in the middle of the desert? This guy is going crazy. And this is, this is a common thing for in the prophets, that the people, they mock them and they make fun of them, right? Yaqub, he said, oh, they're going to say that I'm going senile, I'm losing it, right? So they are people of foresight, people that plan into the future. So, inshallah, we'll talk a little bit more about that on Sunday, and some very, very interesting verses of the Quran about da'wah as well. I like to bring in other topics because there's a lot of sometimes controversy among Muslims about is da'wah and tabligh part of Islam? Is it part of the message? Are we supposed to go out and call on people? And if we're supposed to call on people, what is the correct model? What is the way to invite people to Islam? So, inshallah, we'll talk about that next week as well. So, let's open up the discussion. We have the Zoom open as well in case if there are any questions in the chat, we'll take them. Bismillah. There are no simple questions in ICCP. I don't believe that.
So is it mentioned in Quran that Idris was the first person who wrote with pen, or it is a hadith, and what was the language in which he wrote?
It's neither in the Quran. There are only 3 or 4 verses in the Quran in Surah Al-Safat in which Idris is mentioned, but Idris is praised very, very highly in the Quran without specifics. And so Surah Al-Anbiya, uh, it could be. Well, Surah Al-Anbiya is not in the third. Surah Al-Anbiya is in the middle of the Quran. Yeah. It could be. It could be. It could be, but but then it's just the name as part of the list. أولئك الذين أنعم الله عليهم من النبيين من ذرية آدم ومن حملنا مع نوح. No, Idris is not mentioned there. The only place in which Idris's life is mentioned is Surah Al-Safat. If his name is mentioned in another place, it's possible. In Surah Al-Anbiya. What's the ayah? Um, yeah, yeah. So he's just mentioned that they are from among the prophets, but nothing about him is mentioned. And it's also not, yes, in Surah Maryam, it's also mentioned. Yes. Um, so it's also not mentioned in the hadith. These are about him using the pen. These are from basically, we can call them Christian sources. And what the language was, historians have talked about that. Especially, there's a lot of people that specialize in linguistics and about the history of language. And a lot has been written about, okay, Aramaic and Syriac and Hebrew and Arabic, and what's the connection, and are these sister languages? Is one leading to the other? So much has been written about that. But as for the language of Idris, that has not been mentioned. But I do think it could be related to the fossil records, not fossil records, but the records that have archaeological records that have been found in Babylon, which is really amazing. I mean, if you want to examine the level of sophistication of language and education and development, they have sewer systems and markets and big cities in Iraq. It's just unbelievable what the archaeologists have found in the ancient city of Babylon. So could it be related to that? That is like they have the language of cuneiform, right? In which they have different shapes and they're pressed onto, they have the concept of like ink and basically before paper didn't really exist yet. Um, Later on, papyrus in ancient Egypt became more common. So they would press that into the ink into the animal skins, and they started to use the writing. So most likely it would be something similar to that. That's what we know. Yeah, I mean, also keep in mind that time is different because the lifespans are longer and there's more overlap between the generations. Yeah. But I'm a bit of a skeptic on some of these age theories about the age of people at the time. I think that we kind of assumed that because Nuh alayhi salam, his life was very long, so we assume that everybody's life is long. There's a opposing theory that Nuh alayhi salam, his life was made long intentionally because he had that purpose to fulfill, and he needed to invite his people for a long period of time. And it doesn't mean that every single person had lives of like 1,000 years or something similar to that. Yeah. Ibrahim's lifespan. Well, the going theory was that people had the lifespans were very long, then they shortened, and then they shortened to basically, 40, 50, 60, and then that the lifespans begin to extend again and get longer. But the Prophet ﷺ, he also mentioned that the lifespan of my ummah is, 60 something, and so if you live longer than that, you're on extra credit, you're on overtime. Right? You have bonus time. Yeah. Alhamdulillah. Allah is al-Razaq, Dhul Quwwatil Mateen. Any others? Yes, Brother Abdurrahman. Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
You might have already maybe addressed this topic about uh, Neanderthals. Neanderthals. I'm not really sure if you did in your
A long
previous
time
sessions.
ago, maybe 2 years ago. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I thought that maybe you've addressed it in this halaqa before, like a
We
previous
did,
ones.
but it's like almost 2 years ago.
Oh,
I
okay.
don't expect anyone to remember.
All right, no worries. Because latest and I'm in terms of scientific discovery, it's still there's a question mark around it, but there are DNA samples from island nations where the DNA of Neanderthals mixed with Homo sapiens. And again, I'm just putting a question mark there. Was just wondering if you have any thoughts about what possibly had happened. Is it from the descendants of Adam? Did they possibly marry, or I'm not really sure. I'm just trying to figure out if the Islamic texts have addressed this issue.
Sure. And we also have the benefit that the most recent, so it's not only Neanderthals, right? There's Neanderthals, there's also the early Vikings, and there's a lot of fossil records, especially in the two poles, towards the northern pole and also in the southern pole, that some of the earliest fossil records that show that there are some differences, especially in the skull structure from Homo sapiens. So the Homo is the genus, and then you have sapien, that is the species. So of course, for those that believe in evolution, so the idea is that this is an early form of the human being, and this is something different from the human being. But the more that we have looked into, by the way, the carbon dating and has always been a bit suspect, right? This is a problem in archaeology about um, how to date the timing and how they calculate the date. But the most recent discoveries have shown that actually you have different types of people. They're finding different records from the same time period that shows that there's a little bit of, so evolution, you would expect that you'd have an early form, and then over hundreds of years then you'd have a later form, and then eventually they all have Homo sapiens, right? Otherwise you wouldn't expect to have a variety within the same time period. But the most recent discoveries, according to what I've been reading, is that they're finding variation within the same time period. So this confirms what Muslims already believe, which is that there is a vast array of the variation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put in the earliest generations. And then over time, because of genetic, you can say genetic mixing, that we are over time, there's more standardization, because the genetic pool, you start out with a lot of variation, and in the absence of any mutation, right? So then people are becoming more and more similar. I don't know if that makes sense, right? If there's mutations, then people are becoming more different. Otherwise, people are mixing. So at some point, we're all, as one of the comedians said, sooner or later, we're all going to be beige, right? Because you have all these different colors, but then eventually everybody's going to mix and then we're all going to be the same color, right? And we're all going to we're looking more and more similar, right? Because of that mixing within the genetic pool. So I think, in my view, and this, this is obviously, this is something that has to be studied further. I think that that word Neanderthals has been uh, very conclusory, because the researchers at that time wanted to indicate that this is not a human being, when in fact it was. It was just a very early, very primitive type of a human being. And they wanted to suggest that Neanderthals are closer to primates. But we don't see any shared characteristics between, um, like Homo erectus or Neanderthals and primates. That's part of the theory, but we don't observe any overlap between those two. So this is why within the Islamic way of thinking, and we find this in other religions, Judaism and Christianity, there is room for some evolution, right? But there's no room for the idea that human beings, are the descendants of gorillas, right? We believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created Adam the same way he created all of the other animals. That doesn't mean that there cannot be evolution within an animal over time, right? Of course, we're all evolving every minute, but that's not what people mean when they say the theory of evolution. That kind of theory of evolution, no, we don't believe in that.
Islam is not against, the Quran is not against evolution in a broad sense, but evolution, iteration, Darwinism. No, it is not Darwinism, because Darwin was not perfect. So, I did not have a vision of perfect sense some 50,000 years back.
Yes.
A vision of the other universe.
Mhm.
Because God has created every individual in its own shape. Man has created man, he has created a whale, he has created a cow in that original shape. Because he mentions in Surah Luqman, وأنزلنا من السماء ماء وفيها وبث فيها من كل دابة. That is when I created every kind of animal on this earth. He mentioned it clearly. I think it is in Surah Luqman.
Yeah.
So that Darwinism saying, or the recent research is saying that we are actually descendants from the ape. No, it is not. It's incorrect, because he doesn't have the vision before. What was before that? What was before that? Even recent, last where fish was found, which was at the bottom of the sea, and which was some 1,000 years back. Another animal was some 20,000 years back. Now the glaciers are melting. They see the impression of fossils, which some 20, 50,000 years back. So as our knowledge extends, we see more and more of God's creation, God's wisdom. This evolution Darwinism is not the real, is not the answer. Yes, there was an ape, there was man also. Maybe ape was before man, that is a different thing. Or the fish was before man.
Right.
But man has been from the original man and has remained till then man. He has never mixed his DNA with others. Never.
Right. Yeah, and I personally, I think there's a benefit. I mean, I've read The Origin of Species. I've read Darwin's book. I don't know, like 30 years ago, a little bit less than that. I think it's very fascinating, and the way that he studied animals in Galapagos Islands, and it really exposed people to an awareness of the animal kingdom and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I think that you can read the book and you can take away very different conclusions about Allah's wisdom in His creation and how He created this beautiful system. And some people, they look at the animal kingdom and how we mentioned in the Friday khutbah that all of Allah's creation, وَمَا مِن دَابَّةٍ, right? That is, there is no living creature that is on the earth, وَلَا طَائِرٍ, or even a bird, يَطِيرُ بِجَنَاحَيْهِ, that flies and soars through the sky with its two wings, إِلَّا أُمَمٌ أَمْثَالُكُمْ, except that they comprise their own civilization. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created this balance in ecosystems, right? That they are perfectly adapted to their natural habitat. And Darwin, he observed it and he documented it in such a beautiful way, by the way. And he comes away with the conclusion that, oh, it must be something that happened over time. It's not supported by the fossil records. It's not supported by the genetic records. It's not supported by a lot of the evidence. But when we observe the same realities that Darwin documented, we walk away with a very different creation. فَتَبَارَكَ اللَّهُ أَحْسَنُ الْخَالِقِينَ. Right? That glory be to Allah, the best of all creators. So it doesn't mean some people they're like avoid it. They're like, no, 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 don't study evolution. We shouldn't be afraid of things. We should be able to engage with science, discuss it as a theory. So, especially if you have kids at home and they're studying, they're going into the STEM fields and they're studying evolution, then you should become more literate so you can talk about these theories and see, okay, well, this part of the theory makes sense, this other part is not supported by evidence, and to engage with it. Yeah. Anything else? Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry if I opened the subject. I'm not tied to Idris alayhi salam. But the reason why I was asking about this question, you mentioned there were 300 people living during the time of Adam, his descendants and how the population started to grow. And you might have already mentioned this in the previous sessions on the marriages that had happened.
I did, yeah.
And so I'm not really sure if this was addressed. Were there previous qawm from different species, or were there different, and how did that population growth happen? And the second question is about Idris alayhi salam. You've kind of been to, I think, Egypt or
Yeah, I studied
Iraq,
there. Yeah.
and so you've seen the kind of leap that had happened with the pyramids and how they were built,
Which is much
specifically
later, by the way.
the big ones.
Especially the ones in Giza. This
Yes.
is the much later kingdom in ancient Egypt. The early ancient Egypt, you have to go down to Luxor, Al-Aqsa, or to Aswan. These are
Right.
which is the much earlier. That was actually the center of the early Egyptian civilization.
So, but you could see
Yeah.
the civilization that you had a
Oh
leap,
yeah. Oh
right?
yes. Yes.
Mathematical,
Oh yes.
all of these sciences,
Yeah.
and the same leap happened previously in Iraq, and so these were kind of led by prophets and possibly with divine openings. So I was wondering now, you have the human capacity back then, they're much more able, through, of course, these revelations to build this majestic kind of, or to kind of achieve these achievements. But we're not seeing it, of course, later on through other, like later prophets, where you have these kind of, of course, the achievement of Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is much bigger in terms of society and in terms of governance and terms. But I was wondering, okay, you have human capacity quite different back then, in terms of these sorts of accomplishments. And then my previous question is about the marriages that had happened during. So I just wanted to see your comments about these.
Sure. So I'll take it out of order. The second point first. There are a lot of people that have crazy theories, right? Especially when the pyramids are involved. Until now, we still haven't figured out how they made the pyramids. One of the best theories is that the jinn did it, right? And I find that very compelling because if you think about it, it's such a enormous feat. I don't think that we'd be able to build the pyramids today with the weight of those granite stone. I mean, it's just unbelievable feat. And the engineering. Has anybody been inside of the pyramids? Yeah. And then when you go inside, that it's exactly aligned, the shaft, with the position of the sun. So the sun comes in, the rays, and it's the same. If anybody been to Chichen Itza in Mexico, it's exactly aligned with the four corners of the sun. And it's also aligned exactly, the shadow of the steps in Chichen Itza exactly align with the sun. And it's a calendar. The whole pyramid is a calendar. I mean, just unbelievable stuff, right? That people were able to develop thousands of years ago. Um, so I think that there is some merit to the idea that, well, maybe there was some divine intervention, or maybe even what makes more sense is that maybe there are armies of jinn, or maybe it had some purpose that's different from the one that we think of now, that, oh, this pyramid is just a graveyard, for the pharaoh to live in. Maybe it had some other purpose at the time, and then it later got converted to another use. I find it very compelling, but that's not based on any facts. It's just a feeling that that could be the case. And one good evidence for that is Prophet Dawood and Prophet Sulaiman, because Sulaiman was given the ability to have armies of jinn, right? That would, um, basically construct huge temples and huge buildings, and he would lead armies of jinn, and they would be at his command, right? So that's also a very good possibility. The other thing about the marriages, so we had mentioned what we know, this is actually not agreed upon, but even among in Islam and also in Christianity. But what most of the scholars say is that an exception was made in the first instance, right? Because there were two sets of twins, right? And so each married the other twin, and they had children. And then from that one instance on, it was prohibited for someone to marry a sibling. So it only happened once. And then after that, then they were able to continue the descendants, and then there was intermarriage. But of course, it was not permitted to marry from within the family. That only happened once, because that was necessary for the, propagation of human beings. Otherwise, none of us would be here. Um, Okay, I think that's we'll leave it at that. A lot of food for thought. And also, we should realize that even if things are not authentic, we should, in our minds, be able to separate the information that is confirmed, that we know to be true, and then the information that we think to be true, but we cannot verify, and we're never ever going to verify because we don't have authentic sources that we can go through. And then you just kind of have to live with that, that okay, this is probably true, but I'm not totally sure. And just kind of, you get to the point where you let it go and you're like, that's fine. So then you realize that the knowledge that we have been given is very little. وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا, except for very little. May Allah increase us in knowledge, and may Allah give us beneficial knowledge that brings us closer to Him. Allahumma allimna ma yanfa'una wanfa'na bima 'allamtana وزدنا علما يقربنا إليك يا أرحم الراحمين. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept our studies. May Allah accept our worship and our dua and our prayer. We ask Allah, Allahumma a'inna ala dhikrika wa shukrika wa husni ibadatik. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun wa salamun al mursaleen walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.